Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video about Unit 1 Area Study 2 Decision Making in Markets for VCE Economics. Today we're going to be talking all about the law of supply, which is all about how much producers want to actually supply into the economy. So first up, we're going to look directly at the law of supply. So this is all from businesses' points of view. So as you probably know, businesses are profit motivated. So as the selling price of a good or service increases or rises, businesses want to produce more of that good or service and supply more. So with that, as price increases, the quantity supplied of a good or service increases. So as price increases, quantity supplied increases. And then the inverse is also true. So as price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases as well. That makes a lot of sense. Like, businesses do not want to sell their products at a lower price than they have to. They want to make as much profit as possible. So either of those work for the law of supply. So if you can think of, even just at the moment, if you look at the fact that suddenly a lot of different businesses are producing hand sanitizer, even though they have no past history of producing hand sanitizer, and some of them are doing it for an incredibly large selling price because they know the demand is there, they know it will sell, therefore they want to supply as much as possible. I had experience with this like through sponsored ads because Facebook and Instagram love to hit you with a sponsored ad that's weirdly targeted towards you. There is a coffee company in Melbourne called St. Ali Coffee that for some reason is making hand sanitizer now, and they're selling it for like $30 a bottle for 750 ml, which I don't know what the going rate for hand sanitizer is, but that seems fairly expensive to me. But clearly, because they know they can sell it for a high price, they're motivated to try and sell it at that price. It's also a bit of an example of relative prices, which we looked at in a previous video, if you wanted to make that comparison there. So if we look at the supply curve, one of my simplest, dumbest ways to talk about the supply curve, if you need to know which way it is oriented, supply has the word up in it, and it is an upward sloping curve. Hopefully that is dumb enough that you will always remember it, because the supply curve slopes upwards. To have a fully labeled supply diagram, what you need is you need price on one axis, you need quantity on the x-axis, you need the supply line going in the correct direction, as well with an S to show that it is the supply line, and a title which points out the market for whatever it is. So in this case, we might have been talking about a market for hand sanitizer, and you'd write that in there, and then you'd get the full marks, hopefully for a 2-mark question maybe. And I'm just, for some reason, still writing the rest of this word. Who needs more of it? Let's keep moving on. So, movements in supply are inverse to the movements in demand. They're still just looking at a change in the selling price. So movements with supply are also only when there is a change of the selling price of that good or service, and you are just moving from one point along that line to another point along that line. So when the selling price changes, you are just moving from one point along that line to another point along that line. So if we had an example here, so we'll say with hand sanitizer, maybe it was like $3 a bottle originally, and now it is $30 a bottle because of this pandemic. If you look at that, at $3, there was a amount supplied there, which we'll call Q1. And then when the price increased, there was a significantly large increase in the quantity demanded, as we look at my beautiful straight lines. And we call that an expansion of supply. So as price increased, there was an expansion of supply. Then if we looked at if the opposite was to happen, if we had the price fall from $30 back down to $3, we would move from that original point that we're at for $30, that Q2, all the way back down to Q1. And that would be a contraction of supply as we start supplying less, because it is less profitable to produce that hand sanitizer. Therefore, we are going to have a contraction of supply. So the most important thing to stress, movements only come from a change in the selling price of that particular good or service. If anything other than the selling price changes, it is not a movement. It will be a shift, which we'll look at next. Also really important to stress again that you use the words expansion and contraction in your written answers. It's really important terminology. You really need to use this to show sophistication in your answers, but it's also what VCAR expects when you're doing things at a year 12 level. So I'm going to expect it now that you use it. And that is it for movements in. Next up is shifts in supply. So shifts in supply only occur whenever a non-price factor, so anything other than the selling price, affects the overall level of supply and creates a whole new supply curve. So that's going to either shift it to the left or the right, depending if it's favorable or unfavorable. So in this instance, a favorable shift is always to the right, regardless if it's demand or supply. So in this case, if we were to draw a favorable shift, it would look like this. We'll call that S1. So you can see when you move in a favorable direction, you are supplying a higher quantity at the same price. So if we drew a line across, say like here, you would see that at that price, suddenly there is more being supplied overall. An unfavorable shift is always going to be to the left, where you are producing less at the same price. We call that unfavorable because less is being supplied overall, and obviously that's going to be less profitable too. We're going to look at reasons for these shifts on the next slide. So lastly, some different factors that affect supply and will cause either these favorable or unfavorable shifts to occur. So these all really boil down to two main things, and every example you ever give or are given to answer a question about is going to be about one of these two things. And those two things are if there is a change in the cost of production for a business, or if there is a change in their overall level of productivity or efficiency. And no matter what scenario you're given, it's going to really boil down to one of those two things. And if you can work that out, you'll be able to work out if it's going to be favorable or unfavorable for supply overall. So let's talk through the couple that we have here. So some of the examples of non-price factors that can create shifts in the supply curve are changes in the cost of production. So straight away with that, examples of that are changes in wages. So wages increase, that's unfavorable for supply because suddenly the business has a higher cost of production and they're less incentivized to produce. Also, things like changes in the cost of inputs or resources. So it's more expensive to get our inputs to produce. That's increasing our cost of production and therefore that's unfavorable for supply. If we can get inputs at a cheaper rate, that's going to be favorable for our supply and we're going to be able to supply more at any given price. Changes in efficiency or productivity. This can happen in a number of different ways. My favorite ways to use, because it's always going to be a good answer, are things like education and training. Education and training means that workers will be able to produce more output per unit of input, and therefore that is going to be favorable for supply overall. You can also talk about research and development. If businesses conduct research and development, the overall plan for that is that it's going to hopefully make them more productive. The issue with research and development is that it isn't always successful and you may have a larger outlay with no actual benefit at the end of the day. Another major one that is really easy to explain and comes up a lot is technological changes. So massive things for supply that we talk about all the time. You'd look at some examples of this, like if you looked at the self-serve kiosks at supermarkets, the ones at McDonald's, these are a technological change that lowers the cost of production for businesses and makes them more productive and causes a favorable shift for their supply curve because they can supply a lot more goods and services at the same price they did before because they are more efficient overall. You can also see this in the automotive industry. If you look at the production of cars, originally when they had that, it was a production line where human beings would stand in a row and each would have to roll to put one piece on the car. Whereas those human beings got replaced with robotic arms. And that is a technological change that makes a business more productive and efficient, lowers their cost of production, and is favorable for their overall supply, and that would cause a shift to the right. Climatic conditions, well, that's a big one in Australia. If you look at the fact that we have bushfires every year and massive bushfires this year, that really negatively impacts our overall level of supply. That's hurt like supply of tourism in many places in Victoria and New South Wales, and it also impacts negatively our ability to produce agricultural goods and services, and it causes an unfavorable shift in those areas. And then lastly, government intervention can affect the overall level of supply in certain markets. We talk about this a lot with things like taxes. If there's increased or decreased taxes, increased taxes would be an unfavorable shift for supply for businesses, and decreased taxes would be a favorable shift. But also things at the moment, like the government intervening and closing non-essential businesses. Well, that's very unfavorable for supply in certain markets. So if you looked at the market for, well, let's just say like bars and nightclubs, they can't open at the moment, so they can't supply at all. So this government intervention has caused a massive unfavorable shift in their overall supply. All right, that's essentially it for supply. It's a little bit quicker to get through than demand because it's almost just the inverse thing done over again. I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions at all, feel free to either comment below or send me an email, and I'm more than happy to respond to any of your queries. Make sure you watch some of these other videos to hopefully help you with your Unit 1 Area Study 2 economics, and stay tuned for the next video, which is going to be all about how equilibriums are met and what happens when there are shifts in supply or demand and how new equilibriums are formed. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.